Good evening everyone. I'm Colin Bailey, the director of the Morgan Library Museum. Welcome to the opening weekend, the first weekend of two of our exhibitions, and the last weekend for two of them as well. While we celebrate Jarry upstairs in the Engelhardt Gallery, the Carnival of Being, and Lequeu, Jean-Jacques Lequeu, visionary architect, from the drawings from the Bibliothèque nationale de France. We're also saying goodbye to Dwayne Michael's Illusions of the Photographer and Guercino Master Drawings. Both of the latter shows will be on until Sunday at the end of the, so please, if you haven't seen them, see them again, or if you have seen them, see them again, and begin to see these two terrific shows that are just opening. We have a tremendous exhibition from the Bibliothèque nationale, brought to our attention by colleagues at the Petit Palais, where Jean-Jacques Lequeu was seen last year, the middle of the year, in a very elaborate and scenographic presentation. A selection of these drawings was made to come to the Menil collection in Houston, a slightly larger group just opening here at the Morgan. As we will learn this evening, Jean-Jacques Lequeu was born during the Ancien Régime. He was born in Rouen in 1757. He died impoverished in a small apartment in Paris in 1826, having lived through the Revolution, the Terror, the Directory, Consulate, Empire, and the restored monarchy. He was an architect who built almost nothing and instead constructed many architectural dreams and fantasies. He had in a meticulous, obsessive, or extraordinary style. The Morgan owns one of his drawings from the Anschlager collection that we have placed in an adjoining space, but virtually all the drawings are at the Bibliothèque nationale. They were among the 700 or 800 or so drawings that he left to the French National Library in 1826, which has conserved them happily, and they've been seen rarely. So the drawings, as you will see, are in extraordinary condition. They were really rediscovered. Lequeu was rediscovered by a happy few, in the 1940s, and they've been the subject of study and fascination ever since. But this exhibition is the first museum retrospective devoted to his work and to this extraordinary, imaginative, strange, marvelous, obsessive architect. I want to recognize our colleagues at the Bibliothèque nationale and the Petit Palais, Corinne Lebutuzet, the curator at the BN, and Christophe Leribaud, already mentioned, who organized the exhibition in Paris. Our beloved Eugene and Claire Thor curator, Jennifer Tonkovich, who worked so hard on this exhibition in its installation and its labeling and explication, is suffering from the flu and has missed all of the celebrations this weekend, but we will look forward to her coming back and enjoying seeing all of you looking at Lequeu. Exhibitions like this are challenging and costly. I want to acknowledge our donors, the Pierre and Tana Matisse Foundation, the Alex Gordon Fund for Exhibitions, Asso Tavitian, Robert Dance, Hubert and Mireille Goldschmidt. When we were beginning to think about this project, amazingly, New York, or the New York area, has two great specialists on Lequeu. The first is our speaker tonight, Basile Baudez. The second, Meredith Martin at NYU, will be talking here in April. So we feel very privileged. And Basile was very helpful to us at the beginning of this project as well, and one of his graduate students worked with Jennifer on beginning to explain and document the show. So we have a long relationship around this exhibition. Basile Baudez is a 2006 PhD from the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. He was assistant professor at the Sorbonne before moving in 2018 to Princeton University, where he is assistant professor in the Department of Art and Archaeology. He's a specialist in 18th and 19th century European architecture and works on how architecture and politics have influenced each other, especially in France during the period of the Revolution and Empire. He's completing a book on the role of color in early modern architectural draftsmanship. a specialist and a scholar of architecture and politics, revolution and empire, working currently on color in architectural drawings. What could be better? Who could be better to introduce this topic for us this evening? Please welcome Professor Baudez to the podium.
I'd like to thank warmly the, oops, this is moving. The Morgan Library and Museum and its director, Colin Bailey, for inviting me here, and congratulate again the team that worked on this marvelous exhibition, Eugene and Claire Thor, curator of drawings, Jennifer Tonkovich, and Oleg Musial, who worked on the exhibition. I hope you all saw or will see multiple times, because as we're going to discuss tonight, we'll see that these drawings need attention, need a lot of time to look at them. The depth of and the strata of information that they deliver is quite exceptional. But I would like to start with one of the most iconic images taken from the corpus of Jean-Jacques Lequeu. Blending together text and figures, plans, elevations, and perspective, this watercolor on paper demonstrates the virtuosity of its author. It displays the softest washes, the boldest colors, at rendering in an illusionistic manner textures of wood, sponge, feather, air, flesh, fabric, paper. It masters the rendering of shadows on curved and complex surfaces. As a manifestation of the exceptional talents of the draftsman and an illustration of its tools, this plate today shows up in textbooks, in lecture courses all over the world, and technical treatises. It's signed Jean-Jacques Lequeu delineavit and dated 1782. It's part of a manuscript. It's part of a manuscript that Lequeu bequeathed to the Bibliothèque Royale 1 year before his death, and his manuscript aimed at demonstrating, I quote, the rules of the science of natural shadows and wash in the finished genre, the finished genre. And he wanted to publish this manuscript, or maybe not. We never know really. With Lequeu, it's always kind of a mystery, under the title of Civil Architecture. And we'll go back to this title, Civil Architecture. It is a strange title. Tonight, I would like to present to you the fascinating drawings of Lequeu, who, like the sponge that you can see on the image, oops, where is it? Here, the sponge here, yeah, absorbs all the tendencies of his time and pushes them to the extreme. I argue that under the disguise of a simple drawing manual, this collection, these civil architecture manuscripts, ends up demonstrating its author's distrust in the capacity of the graphic language to convey the complexity of his vision of the world. I would like to unravel tonight this paradoxical idea that you have one of the most gifted draftsmen of his generation who undermines the graphic language in itself. But let's start with a presentation of the man itself. This is how he wants to be seen by posterity. It's how he wants to be shown when he bequests his collection to the Bibliothèque nationale. The self-portrait is dated 1792, and we already have a problem here, because one thing that tells us that this date is a fake date is that his hand is on this plan here, which is a plan of Paris, on which he was working after the revolution in the beginning of the 19th century. His outfit in itself is a post-revolutionary outfit that is not from 1792. So here we're already accustomed to the deception of the information that Lequeu is spreading on his sheets. It is not the only self-portrait in the history of the way Lequeu represents himself. Generally, as you can see here, after a certain date, he shows himself in profile, in the general manner of the antiquarians and in the long tradition of the Roman coins. But here he shows himself in three quarters. And why does he do that? Because he wants to put himself in the long tradition of the architectural frontispieces since the Renaissance. You have on the left the one of the treatise of Vignola, and in the middle the one of Scamozzi, and you see the way Lequeu himself presents himself in this architectural niche in this half-length portrait, looking directly at the viewer. It's a tradition that other contemporaries of Lequeu, like the architect Claude-Nicolas Ledoux, will also adopt. You can see it's the same idea of an architectural setting. You even have the background of the fabric behind the bust of the author. You even have some details that seem the same, like the modules. But if we look slightly closer at the figures themselves, we see a certain number of really striking differences. The first one is the way they appeared as their demeanor and their outfit themselves. Ledoux, on the right, is in the open color tradition of the artist, the way the artists were showing themselves and differentiating themselves from the institutional bourgeoisie or the aristocracy of their time. It's the free spirit of the artist. Lequeu himself, as you can see, is ensconced in this knotted and lovely lavalière, and shows himself really like a bourgeois with his little ring on his pinky finger of his left hand. The other thing is Ledoux shows himself with all the tools of his trade that say, traditionally, since the Renaissance, that are the attributes of the architect. The divider here, the ruler, and the drawings or the prints that show his own projects, and on which you have the laurel branches that show the success that these projects are lifting. Lequeu himself doesn't have any tool or any architectural drawing that would show anything that says that he's an architect. So how does he do to indicate his profession? The first thing that we notice is the text itself, the inscription. And that is very important for how Ledoux envisioned the graphic medium and its relationship with the text. The text is always here to designate, always there to paraphrase, always there to demonstrate what you can see. And so I'm going to go back to this question, there's always a redundancy in Ledoux's drawing, in Lequeu's drawings, and this is the redundancy. You have the name and the title of the architect, and you have the architect here. You have this double designation. The second point that indicates the nature of the architect, it's this whimsical, and that shows the humor and also the erudition of Lequeu. It's this small animal that is at the keystone of the niche, who is a beaver. So the beaver, it's a symbol of hard work in heraldic, and it's an animal that you can find in some etymologies, but it is maybe one of the first instances when it's used for representing architecture. And as we know, the beavers are building dams, are building art, the animal architect. But it's not the only way that is describing its nature as an architect. The most important for him are these volumes and this sheet of paper. So we have different types. It's hard to see. One has to be close to the drawings to really be able to read the labels, and thank God you'll find magnifying glasses inside the exhibition for your enjoyment. So, but one can read carefully with this wonderful writing, this bureaucratic writing that he uses everywhere. So what do we have? We have maps first. We have the map of Paris here that is working on, and what is called geographical maps or maps in geometry. And that's an allusion to his day job in the Land Survey Administration of Paris. That was his regular revenue until in the second part of his life. You have also, and that's the most important in a way of the volumes he's working on, is resting his elbow on the volume itself, the detail of the buildings, détail des bâtiments. So what is that, the detail of buildings? So it is a very technical term in the 18th century. It's the description of buildings destined to contractors and workers. So it seems really far away from the image of the architect-artist, that the architect removed from the construction site, removed from the greediness of the everyday working details of the contractors. But one has to remember that Lequeu comes from this world. His father was a carpenter from Rouen and draftsman also. And most of his employment before being at the Land Survey was being an inspector for several architects on building sites, especially Soufflot, the author of the Paris Pantheon, the Sainte-Geneviève at the time, and his nephew, Soufflot the Roman, for whom we're going to see he worked on the building site of the Hôtel de Montauban. So the other things that we find also are something that sounds extremely strange, and there's always something very strange that Lequeu puts, but it's not that strange when you think about the time. It's these necessary tools for bleaching the fine linen. So he wrote a certain number of technical treatises in all kind of capacity, and that really it is something very common in the 18th century milieu of the French technicians, architects. They invent a lot, and they write a lot of memoirs all the time on all kind of inventions and technological procedures that they try to sell to the government. So that's of course, one of the financial means of all these people, especially at a time of a crisis of the construction. So there's also there's the treatise, and we see also there are some projects that are not shown like on the Ledoux frontispiece as drawings or prints, but in volumes, as they were books. So we have certain projects that are known, certain projects that are not known and maybe never existed, but basically that they are there to show the range of the type of architecture it can produce. Religious architecture, civic architecture, public architecture, and domestic architecture. And that the way he wants to present his portfolio and his versatility in architectural projects. And finally, we have the geometrical principles of drawing, a drawing manual that alludes to his pedagogical ambitions. Indeed, all his life and until today, Lequeu was recognized and is recognized for his extraordinary talent as a draftsman. He was trained at the Free Drawing School in Rouen that was destined at craftsmen and workers for the textile industry. But soon enough, he started to work and teach. And if he followed the first part of the classic training, as we can see from Cochin's famous plate illustrating the article drawing in the encyclopedia, which was when you were young, you started to copy works on paper, prints and drawings, mostly in parts and then in full, and then you would move to three-dimensional works, mostly small plaster casts, and that's what you wouldn't do in Rouen, because that was the difference between the artists and the craftsmen and the workers. You would draw or model through in front of a live model. It's this pedagogical way comes from a very long tradition, from the Renaissance. And I show you here the persistence and the stability of this tradition of the way to learn how to draw. Here you have a 1608 treatise by Fialetti, and you have a 1782 method to learn the drawing by Jombert, and you can see that it's basically exactly the same. You decompose the certain number, the parts of the face in order afterwards to learn to reassemble them. The wonderful idea, and how does Lequeu translate this idea of these parts of the training? He basically decomposes the face as it was in what the surrealists in the 20th century will recognize as a wonderful premonition of what they see, these amazing parts of the three-dimensional head. But much more than the tradition from which he comes, Lequeu is really embedded in his time. And his time is, and especially the people he's looking for, are not so much trying to reproduce reality through the imitation of reality, through the observation of reality, but by mathematical constructions. And that's what his treatise wants to do in a very strange and almost systematically and ambivalent way, which doesn't really work, but gives the feeling of, the impression of working. It's not something totally new, as we can see here from the same Fialetti drawing, the idea of using mathematics to construct the drawing of the body has been done before, but what Lequeu does is really taking the new trends in mathematics, and especially the development of his contemporaries in the descriptive geometry that is taught to military engineers, and applies that to the human body. The interesting thing in our case is that it doesn't work at all. As we can see here, when we compare the rendering of a skull and the way by the geometry Lequeu transforms the skull has nothing to do with a real skull. It's the illusion of the real skull that is the produce of his imagination and mathematics. But because what interests really Lequeu also more than even the mathematical construction of the body is basically the deformation of the body. And here again, he inserts himself in a long tradition, as we can see from this study sheet by Giuseppe de Ribera, the fascination of the drawing of the inner mouth with the shortening and the complexity of the rendering of these three dimensions is something that interests Lequeu, but that interests a lot of people at the same moment. Lequeu is not alone in this story, and as we can see, Joseph Ducreux is also trying these things, or Messerschmitt, or even Boilly at the end of the life of Lequeu. But what is specific also with Lequeu, that he tries, and like a bee, he really takes the honey from all the traditions and all the contemporary trends that he can put his hand on. And one of these contemporary trends is the physiognomy. It's this new science that is developed especially by this Swiss author and philosopher, Lavater, which posits that you can describe the character and the inner essence of an individual by studying its his facial features. And the best way to see that is by drawing by a line drawing, looking at its profile. And it's exactly the way Lequeu represents himself and draws his contemporaries also. It's this profile that will, as you can see here, really reveal its true personality, the personality that it's thing. But it's not only that, because profile for an architect is a very specific thing. It's not the same thing that for a normal artist. There is a tradition of the profile. There is an obsession about the architectural profile. And if you compare the way he shows Brutus, the son of Caesar, that he calls the first emperor, there's always some inaccuracy of the references and the history in Lequeu. It goes very fast. So Caesar becomes suddenly the first emperor. But so you can see the way it really reflects the same type of drawing that he would show an architectural profile. And that it comes also from a long tradition of the analogy of the human profile and the architectural profile, as you can see here from one of the most important pedagogues and theorists of the 18th century that Lequeu knew at the time. But he's not only looking at his French contemporaries, he's also looking at Pyrenees, whom plates he was collecting and books he was collecting. But if you look at the way Pyrenees is showing the different profiles, architectural profiles, and the way Lequeu, by reversing the black and white of the sheet, when it is easy to read the Pyrenees sheet with its complexity, with its mise en page that is really innovative. And when Lequeu tries to imitate that and reverses the relationship between black and white, it becomes quite an impossible image. So the way for Lequeu to go beyond these impossible images, for him, is really to use light and shadow. And that is basically, he tries to show that construction has to be mathematical, but if you only see this half of the page, it's kind of impossible to recognize that this is a nose. You really need, and that's what he tells us, by adding the shadows, you really need the shadows. And this importance of the shadows is shown in the frontispiece of the architectural civil. The first page that will tell you really the nature of the treatise. And what does it show? It shows the cast shadows of different types of shapes, as you can see, from a single source of light. And this question of light is extremely important in his treatise. It's not also something that comes out of nowhere. There were a lot of treatises that were dealing with the question of the shadows and how to build them, which would give the third dimension on the piece of on the sheet of paper. I show you one by de la Gardette, which is 1786, and you see how it's done. But what Lequeu does, he goes much further, and you can see the complexity and the impossibility of learning anything from the complexity of the cast of the shadow here, of its capital that you have here. What is interesting, as usual with Lequeu, is to go beyond complexity, is to show virtuosity, showing extremely complex shapes, to show the possibilities, and shapes that are nowhere to be used in architecture, which have nothing to do with architecture itself. And when he shows architecture and uses architecture, he will privilege this round sphere. So it is the moment when everybody does a lot of round spheres. But what interests Lequeu is not so much the round sphere as a symbol, than the way of showing really his mastering of the projected shadows. And what is it? I wanted to show you these images by Boulez, the famous cenotaph to Newton, and two projects that a Chapel for the Dead, an Entrance of a Cemetery, to show you really the difference with what Lequeu is doing. They are exact contemporaries, and Boulez was an amazing, successful architect that Lequeu certainly was extremely envious of. He had a great school, a lot of teachers. He was member of the Royal Academy. He had a lot of commissions. He was, after the revolution, member of the Institute. He was fine, thank you very much. And he developed this theory, and his students did, of the theory of the shadows. And it's quite different from what Lequeu is doing. Lequeu is not so much at the end interested in the shadows. He's interested in the light. It's the light that is important, and not so much the simple shapes and the way the shadows and the contrast are defining the shapes themselves. What interests Boulez here is, by contrasting shadow and light, it gives a sense of the sublime. The sublime is this big moment in the 18th century where you, instead of having only rational understanding of architecture, you have a sensational understanding of architecture, with your senses, with your feelings. And what Boulez wants to do is wants to feel the architecture. Be afraid, be touched, be moved by the architecture. It's certainly not what Lequeu is trying to do. And Lequeu so develops an architecture of the light, and you can see that in some details, which are quite interesting, I think. So here you have the renderings for the Salon of the Hôtel de Mouton, where he was in charge of the interior decorations. It's not exactly clear what was his absolute role. He was a surveyor on the building site. And how he represents the windows. And you see this yellow wash, this very clear, like light wash. It is absolutely not in the conventions of the classic way of representing the glass in the 18th century, especially the glasses of the window. In France, it's extremely clear. There's color conventions since the beginning of the 18th century that everybody will use, is that how to differentiate and to lift the ambiguity between the mirror and the window, you use different colors. So for the window, you use the green wash, and for the mirror, you will use the blue one. So here, what Lequeu does is breaks with this tradition at the fear of not being really understood at one point by the people he's using here. And it's also a way to introduce poetry inside his interiors. Here you have a drawing by another of his colleagues, Pierre-Adrien Paris, and you see the way he draws the mirrors and the reflection of the room in the mirror. And what does Lequeu do here? That's a lot, I mean, these people. In the mirror, you have a view of clouds. An impossible view, because obviously this is the room you're seeing. So it's this opening on the outside. Even this is this is a working drawing. This is a presentation drawing for a client. It's not a fantasy. We're not in the crazy land of Lequeu, in the thinking about in its attic. It is really something that is meant for a client. And here he introduces this thing. And so we see the way he pushes the conventions, he breaks the tradition, that he appropriates. We see it also in the use of the colors. Here you see, for example, the way he uses this pink wash around the elevation, the interior elevation, to show the cut masonry. This is a classic way of doing since the late 17th century. It's a convention that was developed by the military engineers in France and that most of Europe adopted afterwards. And it's not only cut masonry, but also anything that is cut and to indicate, and even as you can see here, the ground. But what Lequeu does, so like some of his contemporaries also, is to push this convention to a decorative one, to something that is meaningless, that is senseless. Here or here, as you can see, that doesn't correspond to anything that has to do with ground or section or anything. And the same way that some of his contemporaries will use this pink as a border in a way of framing the architecture they're looking at as a real frame, he will do the same thing, but breaking totally all illusion of a cut masonry to transform this cut masonry into a real frame, into a drawing that is with a mat. So that's exactly the way he does. And he pushes the limit of draftsmanship to even invent new types of presenting the drawings at a point of illegibility, at the point of it's almost impossible to understand the nature itself of what is representing. Here you have a series of propositions from the dome of a church, the Church of the Madeleine, and here you have an absolute unicum in the history of architecture of this elevation that is basically turned down at a place where it shouldn't be, where there's no reason it should be torn down here, which doesn't give any kind of proportions, that doesn't give any sense, and it's not because he doesn't have space, he has space on his sheet of paper. So he frees himself to all the kind of convention, playing with them systematically. But where is really the most interesting also, it's in another way of playing on the sheet of paper. It's the relationship between the text and the image. So this is nothing totally new. Since the 18th century, you have the idea of a long caption, a legend under the text, or under the image to explain it, was popularized. Here you have an example of the way also Lequeu borrows from classic image books his own compositions. And you can see here in the encyclopedic manuals, it is the same thing, from Abraham Boss to Pyrenees with the long caption. What is new is what Pyrenees starts to do also. It's to introduce the texts and the captions inside the plate itself. And with when the image is subjecting the text to its placement. As you can see here, for example, the text is on a vertical way to follow the sense of itself, of the image itself. It's exactly the same thing that does Lequeu, but as you can see here, Pyrenees stays and controls the relationship between the text and the image. And the text is here to bring something new to the image and stays always subjected to the image. Whereas in Lequeu, the text starts like that and then goes everywhere, absolutely invades the sheet. So I'd like to stay a little on this drawing to really make my case here. The originality of Lequeu in this tradition is that the text is both a demonstration and an explanation. And what is interesting, it's not only one way, it's not only the object that is described, but also the use of the object and the way to draw it. There are several layers of information in here. If I take the example of the bucket, you have here. The bucket, you have the indication of the representational mode, plan, elevation. Plan, elevation. You have the convention of the representation, punctuated profile. You have the materiality of the bucket. It's in faience here. You have the destination of the bucket. It's the letter V here, and it says bucket with a smooth and steep bottom made to roll a little bit of ink at a time mixed with pure water. And finally, with T, you have the procedure. Edges where one discharges the tip in order to make it very sharp. So the level of information that is delivered as for this small object is on every part fascinating. This mode of representation with multiple reading strata perfectly illustrates the ambiguity of architectural drawings. Because what is the purpose of this plate? Is it the temple that is represented itself here, the project? Are they the drafting tools? The act of drawing itself? The drawings contained in the treatise that come after this plate represent, I quote, with figures by which use and how one should wash the plans, elevations, and profiles of opaque bodies. But when one would expect the captions to give instructions to how to draw the figures, it's supposed to be a drafting manual, Lequeu instead goes on explaining the project itself. So you can see here, for example, for the dairy, the explanations are how to make the wood non-combustible. It's not about how to draw the projects. It's how to build it. It's a technical, it's almost, the information is about technicity. So we can ask ourselves, what is the nature of the manuscript? Is it a pretext to provide models for the public, the amateurs, the professionals? A presentation more or less subtle of a collection of his own compositions for promotional purposes? Or is it another of these drawing manual books for aspiring architects, engineers, surveyors, cartographers, or even amateurs who don't have access to proper office training? Further points add confusion to the nature of its project. For example, there are very, very few plans. Lequeu doesn't use the classic triad since Vitruvius of the plan, the elevation of and the section. Most of his views are only elevations and sections, basically like artists' views and not architects' views. The other thing, he doesn't present the classic 5 orders that every single architectural treatise since the Renaissance have to do with. No, instead he presents his own orders of invention with, for example, here, the aristocracy enchained, thanks to the benefits of the revolution, etc. And also but so you would say, oh, these are artist drawings, these are drawings for exhibition, and so they will have all the picturesque tools that other architects will use. For example, human staffage. I show you here from Ledoux and Boulez, the human staffage. Or here, perspective. But no, the architectural drawings of Ledoux are all in geometrical. They have never used perspective. They are really sticking to the convention of architectural representation, where the parallels are parallels. They don't have any humans inside them animating the building itself. So it doesn't go that way either. So where does it go? That's the question. It's interesting because the texts are moving constantly further from the construction reality, from the project themselves. He enters into digressions, imprecation, poetry. On one, there's like, perish, cursed by God with his race, whoever acts, speaks, or thinks against the Republic. Okay, fine. Or here, you have an example of a project for a grotto in a park, and on the side, show you here, you have an extensive list, like a Umberto Eco list of tree species that constitutes the woods that are supposed to go to top this grotto. But the trees themselves are nowhere to be seen. They're only described in this extremely long list, extremely precise. So here the text replaces the drawing. Lequeu, who authored several theater plays, who wrote several treatises, we saw the bleaching linen treatise, seems at the end to distrust the ability of the graphic language to convey his ideas, and even to show the wealth of his poetic mind, the world he tries to describe. Both the redundancy of the text and the image, the constant invention of his writings around and on the figures, testify of this failure of his drawings. It is the paradox of one of the most gifted draftsmen of his generation to finally demonstrate the inability of the medium to correctly and fully translate on the sheet the products of his imagination. Thank you.